On the 13th of August, 2020, students across the country received their A-level results. But this year was different. After months of school closures and disruptions, this exceptional group of students hadn't sat any exams. Instead, an experimental algorithm was used, organising students based on merit and school ranking to allocate their grades. The consequences of this were massive, with it being reported that almost 40% of students received lower grades than they expected. More than this, we saw students from underprivileged areas coming out much worse off than their privileged counterparts. The public's reaction was to dismiss the algorithm, claiming it was wrong. But I think the truth is much more sinister. I think that the algorithm highlighted an ugly truth about education inequality in this country. After just 4 days, the grades from the algorithm were retracted and teachers' predictions were published instead. Even though the situation is resolved now, I don't think it should be swept under the rug because there is so much to learn from it. So where exactly did it all go wrong? To understand where it went wrong, we need to understand what an algorithm is and how they're developed. Put simply, an algorithm is a set of instructions that can be given to a computer to solve a problem. Here's an example of a simple algorithm. Now, this is intuitive. This is your thought process written down. But what do we do when the situation is too complicated to solve in our heads? Well, we can use a computer to solve it for us. Statistical analysis can be used to develop algorithms for even the most complex of problems. So where exactly are we using statistical analysis? In things like weather forecasting, insurance, medical studies, every major industry uses statistical analysis in order to make the most informed decisions possible. We can use statistical analysis whenever we have data from the past, as we can look for patterns in order to predict the future. It's probably quite similar to how you make a prediction in your head, but typically on a larger scale and using a lot more maths and computing power. It's basically a very educated guess. And you're hoping that everything continues on a similar trend. And if it does, you're well prepared for the situation. Now, this is all great in theory. And even in practice, it's extremely powerful. But there is one flaw. What if the data is wrong? Now, wrong can be defined in multiple ways. Does the data contain legitimate errors? Or maybe the data is only capturing part of the story. Perhaps the data is completely correct, but it's telling the wrong story. A computer can't detect these issues, which is why analysis needs human input, otherwise the wrong story could be told as fact. Generally, we're uncomfortable with the idea that data can be used to predict our behavior. We feel unique, and we believe in our free will. So when someone tells us that they can predict our future, we don't typically believe them. But the truth of the matter is that with enough correct data, human behavior can be accurately predicted. Our brains are simply processing tools. We are shaped by our experiences, and we are more similar to one another than we like to believe. So the question for the algorithm is, was there enough data to predict grades accurately? I'd say there was to an extent. I think that they used the best data that we had available. But there are still gaps in our ability to measure factors that affect human behavior. Perhaps they wouldn't have used the algorithm if it had any major flaws, but they likely didn't consider or feel concerned about some of the details. A key thing to note is that it's practically impossible to create an algorithm with 100% accuracy. There are always outliers. But typically, the number of outliers is so small that we accept the loss. However, given that the results of this algorithm would set the trajectory for the rest of someone's life, perhaps they should have identified them and handled them a bit differently. Students were upset that they didn't get the grades that their teachers predicted. But teachers often overestimate, so the algorithm had to account for this. From the students' perspective, they weren't allowed to sit in an exam, so they expected what the teachers told them, and they planned their life accordingly. On reflection, I think that the issues surrounding the algorithm stemmed from a combination of mismanaged expectations from students and a lack of trust in the algorithm. Perhaps we haven't progressed enough as a society to place trust in things that we personally don't understand. That's all to say, the algorithm was likely correct for most cases. And when you're predicting grades for an entire country, that seems like a great result. But what about the people that the algorithm got wrong? Perhaps the statisticians should have reflected and said that these are real people, and even one person's results being incorrect is too much. Perhaps they placed too much focus on the numbers, forgetting the human element that was driving the process. When I started my first role as a data analyst, I would get results first and ask questions later. I was lucky that my manager at the time knew that I'd make those mistakes. So every time I'd send something across, he'd send it straight back with a list of considerations that he knew I hadn't made. It was in this role where I learned what critical thinking truly is. And I think it's quite possibly the most useful skill that anyone can have. Being able to consider every consequence of every action before it's even happened means that you're acting preventatively, not reactively. For the A-level algorithm, they made the choice to revert to teachers' predicted grades after 4 days. They were under immense pressure from the public to just drop the algorithm altogether. And this made it so that they had to rush things, and they didn't have time to come up with a better solution. And the consequences of doing this were brutal for students and universities alike. Universities give out places knowing that not everybody is going to get their predicted grades. So when it actually does happen, it means that some courses are massively oversubscribed. This meant that during 2020, some universities offered students £10,000 to defer for just a single year. Now, these knock-on effects were also brutal for less popular universities, which are typically insurance choices. Since everybody got into their first choice, the number of students at these less popular universities plummeted. And this meant that for the lecturers at these universities, the teaching demand was much lower, and the risk of them losing their jobs was high. In reflection, the algorithm gave us a fascinating and necessary look at education inequality. Exams empower students to take control of their own future. Now, when that control is taken away, it induces fear. If you do poorly in an exam, you can blame the difficulty of that exam to an extent, but you mainly have to take responsibility for your own shortcomings. But when a statistician, who you've never even met, tells you that you would not have been able to achieve your predicted grade, it becomes very easy to shift all of the blame onto them. Now, we do this to avoid mental anguish And I think that looking at the situation from that perspective makes it very easy to understand the public's response. However, it is absolutely crucial to note that plenty of people were upset with their grades before 2020. The algorithm shone a spotlight on a harsh reality. It triggered people to speak up about problems, but those problems had always been there. Low-income areas were receiving lower grades, and a racial bias became apparent, with ethnic minorities generally receiving lower grades than their white counterparts. Unfortunately, these are reflections of what happened every single year without the algorithm. There are clear links between location and quality of education. Before 2020, these biases existed. They just weren't as visible. By dismissing the algorithm, these problems go right back into the shadows. People were so upset that a computer was deciding their grades that they placed their attention on the wrong thing. These biases weren't due to statistics or computing. They were societal biases that will continue to impact people long after 2020, especially if we can't come together, reflect, and make real change. Especially if we villainize an equation instead of the system that created these inequalities. It's easy to look back in hindsight and to understand where everything went wrong. But we lacked the critical thinking to understand what we were getting ourselves into before it was too late. We were rushed by a pandemic, and the worst case scenario became reality. The A-level algorithm was a very large-scale example of what goes wrong when we don't think critically. But we all make choices every single day that have consequences. So next time you're faced with a choice, think critically. Consider the consequences. Nurture that part of your brain. And maybe one day, we can be a more thoughtful, future-thinking society. Thank you for listening.